Schwarzkopf said it, when in command, take charge. Okay? Make the hard decisions. Obtain 20, 30, 40% of intel and then go. Well, you can't do that if there's not a sanctity of thought and a certainty of spirit. And then if I do those things, then I just replicate it. And employees see that. You know, they see those actions. Your kids see it. You know, your wife sees it. You know, your little baby will see that. You know, she'll see the consistency of Dad being there no matter what. And again, as controversial as it may sound, my belief is to be the best father one can be, it needs to start with me. Kids first, kids second, immediate family third, school events, sport, shopping, food, mortgage, bills, weddings, bar mitzvahs, funerals, brisses, you name it, there's all the things. And then there's a huge chasm right over there in the corner. Is your poor old father. Position that's got nothing to do with time. Zero. It's got everything to do with priority.
Please give me a minute of your time. If analytics are to be believed, you're more likely to be a listener than a subscriber. No, this isn't a plea for your money, but it is a plea for your support, which can be free. The good news is you're already doing the hard part by taking the time to listen to conversations that are consequential. This show is still being built episode by episode, guest by guest, and your subscription and feedback helps me to determine who to invite, what to ask, so we can ensure that we deliver the most consequential content to you possible. So please, take a moment to subscribe on your platform of choice. Thank you for listening. Now, let's get on with the show. Leadership is the most taught and least examined of the management disciplines. Business schools sell philosophies of it by the meter, and yet the people who buy those philosophies are almost never asked, years later, which of them actually held when they were in the trenches. The student who studied leadership and the practitioner who then had to make the number, hold a team together through a bad quarter, or build something from nothing, are usually the same person. And seldom do they have to reconcile the two aspects out loud. My guest today is one of the few in a position to do exactly that. As a postgraduate, he was drawn to the philosophy of leadership more seriously than many of his cohort. I know, because I was in the room. He has spent 2 decades in financial services, an industry with famously little patience for abstraction, where he now leads direct sales at Totality, formerly Saxo Australia. And alongside that institutional career, he built DadBodz, a health venture founded not on a strategy deck, but on the deeply unglamorous problem of getting time-poor fathers to change their behaviour and, harder still, to keep it changed. The question I want to put to him is whether the ideas we are handed about leadership are the ones that survive contact with the target, or whether practice quietly writes its own philosophy, and we merely flatter ourselves that the books came first. David Harvie, welcome to On the Subject of Leadership.
Great to be here, Robert. Great to be here.
And as ever, lovely to be talking to you again. To the risk of taking listeners down memory lane, I very, very fondly remember our lectures together in during our MBA with Professor Robert Spillane, and the hours we spent wrestling with the foundations of leadership and the philosophies of management thought. It
was a ton of fun. I think there are a number of things that stood out. You probably recall the diversity in the room as well.
Very much.
A little bit of a rabbit warren, but I do remember a debate as to who actually won World War II. And I know the Russians in the room had a very different view to us, so that was fun. But yeah, just quickly on Robert, and maybe just double clicking there. Meeting Robert was like meeting my father. Classically trained, glint in the eye, terribly sometimes taciturn, curt, acerbic. But once you sort of double clicked a little bit, there was just such a warmth, with Professor as well.
Yeah.
Just such a, yeah. It was like walking in a room with my dad every single time.
Yeah.
Who I'll always admire and aspire to be. the other interesting part about Robert was, and I think it took us all a few weeks to work it out, that as he moved through sort of chronologically in time, and again double clicked on a particular exponent of leadership, he adopted the character. And so, the character that he was in week 1 was different to week 2, was different to week 3. And I think after about week 2, I thought, oh, that's what he's doing.
Yeah.
He's a method actor at the same time. So yeah, they were really fond times. And then obviously, without sort of sounding sycophantic, getting to meet minds like yours.
Oh,
from
too kind.
And you're coming from my sort of background, of which no doubt we'll get to, but it was a real eye-opener for me. It was like Pandora's box. I peered into the looking glass, and once one's eyes were open, they can never be shut.
So true. And at the very risk of becoming the Robert Spillane podcast, he was unique. I think he wrote a stage play at one point, and I think there was always that sort of method actor. But his ability to really get into the philosophy and hold it and walk around in its shoes in a seminar, I know was both very invigorating for those of us who I think engaged with it, but I could also see how challenged some of the other students were because they were used to more of a manager construct. My manager is just a certain personality in a certain way, and I get that consistency. And now here's effectively the equivalent of a manager in a classroom setting, arguing one point one week, and then arguing the completely opposite point the next week. And of course, it was always about that pursuit of truth, that pursuit of knowledge, that pursuit of understanding and wrestling with a philosophy to really wring it of its value. And I think the thing that I most lament in corporate life is the lack of that, the tendency to need to create alignment, to create consistency. And I see the value in an organization, but I do sometimes miss that that strength to argue a point, not because one necessarily believes it, but because we need to stress test the strategy. Yeah. And I think I've often seen in political institutions they do that very well, where someone gets appointed as devil's advocate, and you need to argue the opposition's case. I feel organizations would often benefit from bringing that type of approach in.
Yeah, I mean, look, we're here. And I know there's a lot to get through, a fair amount to get through, or the topics to get through, but could be controversial. But I'll sort of bring up the diversity piece, and for me, diversity is diversity of thought at the end of the day. And look, the other elements are clearly, obviously, what goes into that. Well, there are inputs such. So, country kid, far northwestern New South Wales, public school environment. Dad was a bank manager. I bring a lens of leadership in a small country town, and the way that Dad led, and the way that the other, generally men, back then, although our headmistress was a woman to be reckoned with. But and then how you had the farmers who would lead sort of, that little empire of theirs, and then the local sergeant, and then the judge, and, the two publicans, and the president of the golf club and the bowling club. Like those models of leadership were demonstrated to me as a little tacker. And that puts one in great diversity. Well, has one have diverse, obviously, lens, or a different lens as opposed to, and I'm not sort of passing judgment here nor otherwise, but generally in my industry, and I underscore generally, the leaders and or those that have advanced have a very different background. I'll pick on one sort of lineage of Lower North Shore private school, possibly came from a background where one's father and mother were in law or politics or industry, as opposed to mine. So that can work really well when those opposing lenses and perspectives are in a room, particularly when you then come to make decisions as to how to engage with those things called clients and customers.
Very much.
And then construct strategy that not only engages with those things called clients and clients and target markets, but also with your people, and those that you're seeking to lead, because again, that diversity of background, perspective and thought and models provides that diversity and ability to be able to execute against a strategic plan, which ultimately, paradoxically, does require alignment, is my perspective at some point.
And certainly, I'd imagine it's that background coming from that lens of very unique leadership styles in far northern New South Wales. Perhaps, do you think that was what drew you to the philosophy of leadership more than many people in our cohort? And what was the idea, or perhaps thinker, that I guess got hold of you most? And were you either reacting to or perhaps against something in understanding and gravitating towards that philosophy or thinker's approach to leadership?
Great question. As soon as I think it started to click when I'm understanding that sort of the different models of leadership, bucket A, bucket B. Bucket A, I've kind of got to do it because I've got to. So there's, this coercive power, or he's got 3 stripes on his shoulder, or he's the headmaster. The headmaster in primary school, as opposed to the headmistress in high, they were 2 very different leaders. In fact, the primary school, and maybe because we're all rat bags and he didn't have any sort of scope to be anything other than this, but he was what we would call these days a manager by assumed authority. Because he had the 3 stripes on the chevrons on the shoulder. So he ruled with an iron fist and with very little logic. So there was definitely no ethos. Absolutely, the pathos was there. He'd share war stories. But ironically also no logos. There was no logic. And that really irked me as a kid. And sort of noticed that with my son now too. He's inherited the same thing. Like if you can't, and I've noticed also with people that I lead, in particular now the youth of today. The youth of today, in my humble opinion, require logos more than ever. They require logic behind, a reasoning behind a particular argument or a strategic decision. If they get that reasoning, and it may or may not be in their favour, at least they can sort of digest that and handle that. So it's, I guess, in answer to your question, going back to sort of the past, but then when I started to open texts, which actually discovered this or discussed this, that bifurcation between leadership is granted by virtue of one's, or power and authority is granted by virtue of the chevrons on the shoulder, as opposed to, well, no, hang on, what about referent power? What about earned power? What about legitimate power that's actually derived from the words, the actions, the demonstrated empathetic care for, the individual on the other side of that equation? You're not just driven by Marked and Hershaft, but actually driven by demonstrative actions that land on the recipient or on the other side, and usually that would be me as I was moving up through the ranks. I've always experienced that personally, but then when I started to read the text and the thinking behind it, it's like, oh, hey, presto. I found systems and frameworks and writings and thinking that have explored what I sort of was wrestling with and not knowing how to, I guess, verbalise nor rationalise. Pretty well, as I said, ever since I've been a kid.
Mm. And do you think that attraction was more intellectual? I mean, we often see children, they feel, or I suppose, as I think it was R.G. Collingwood noted, we tend to feel before we think. We sort of go, a tiger, rather than a tiger, But then obviously as we grow, that logic, that rationality starts to come in more. Was your attraction driven increasingly as the intellect and the rationality began to kick in, or do you see it as a more underlying temperamental element?
Oh, definitely underlying. That's such a great question. And again, why I enjoy our friendship so much is you bring out, and these kind of conversations bring out the best in oneself in terms of the intellectual piece. So, I dusted off some of the notes ahead of, I'll disclaim it, ahead of the discussion, because it's like, well, for the 364 days prior to this discussion, I've been head down, bum up, in financial services or building a business, which we'll get to, or worrying about P&Ls or cash flows or spreadsheets or putting together pitch decks and so on and so forth. And so therefore that's obviously very, it's all action.
Yeah.
Okay. And so part of my daily routine, we'll get to leadership of self, no doubt, a little bit later. But parallel to that, Robert, I have spent an inordinate amount of time, invested a terrible amount of time, in fact, a fantastic amount of time, in leaning on some of these structures, but then being eclectic, practical, pragmatic, but also tapping into here as to what, and here as to what works for self, and then being able to apply that in a personal and professional life. So in answer to your question, I think it was the intellectual sort of piece that whetted one's appetite. And I love to discover and unpack and lift the bonnet and, okay, well, that's how all that works. And I actually don't agree with that model, but I actually like a bit of that, and then you can construct your own. So I'll always do. But for me, it's more about, well, what does that provide me? How does it make me feel emotionally? Where does it put me in the hierarchy of needs? And then having visibility on where I personally sit within that at any one point in time, such that I'm a super effective leader, a fantastic father, a wonderful friend, and dare I say it, in love with myself.
I think.
Dare I say that?
Yeah.
Dare I say
look, I think that's definitely something I want to unpack a bit as the show goes on, because certainly, and maybe it's my increasingly old man's eyes of the world, self-esteem, or more to the point, lack of, seems to be an increasing challenge. And when I see a lot of poor management practice in organizations, invariably it comes back to the person with positional authority having self-esteem issues. They effectively don't have enough self-love. So they're constantly trying to instead treat the leader-follower relationship as an act of taking people on a journey. They're treating it more as followers in more of a servant or a retainer or a worshipper in some sense element. How can I fill that void that is within me, that lack of self-esteem, that lack of self-love? How can I fill that? And I need to fill it extrinsically rather than intrinsically. So in many ways, I'm very happy when I hear leaders, particularly very senior leaders, talk about notions of self-love, obviously in a very healthy sense, not in a narcissistic sense, but it gives them that grounding, that confidence, that when you're having that bad week, instead of negatively reacting to the team, to the business, to the industry, you've got those reserves of, okay, I can maintain my professionalism because at center, I know that I'm okay, and I'm working, and I question myself every day. I think self-doubt is very important, so long as it doesn't become overly critical. But yeah, that ability to anchor in a degree of self-love, I think, is missing in a lot of people's lives.
Auctoritas, as Friedrich would put it. And if we sort of double click on that piece, it's the ability to be able to put a position or posit a position or argue a case. And I've done that for my pretty well entire professional life. And I used to, again, going back to school, they used to call me the bush lawyer, right? Because as a 7, 8, 9, 10-year-old, and then later in my teens, I'd continually try and argue the case. Oh, well, I don't deserve the cane because of X, Y, Z, A, B, C. And then even in my younger career, I remember my first job very clearly. It was in a merchant bank, tucked away in a corner, getting yelled at by advisors and brokers, which, by the way, is why I got into the career. I actually kind of a topic for another time, but I actually fell into that role. And I'm getting yelled at by advisors and stockbrokers and those sort of things, managing a huge amount of assets. And I thought to myself, these guys are a-holes. I'm not an a-hole, so maybe I can do this job. And sort of here we are all those decades later. But they had none of that at all. I was so naive, but I was not naive enough to not see that they were completely oblivious to their own behaviour, which was an abhorrent behaviour.
Yeah.
And that was steeped in that organisation. I mean, it was a fantastic place to be. It was the place to be, by the way, where I started. Bankers Trust, right? BC. In the hollowed, ivory towers, I should say, not hollow towers, although maybe that was a Freudian slip. And the ivory towers up here at Chifley, just behind me. And the building was nice, and there's marble return at the front, and the lovely lady behind the counter had her hair pulled back in Prada, but the whole thing, right? But there was just a lack of base there. And again, as I said, not so much within the organisation as much, to be fair, but certainly with the counterparts that we're dealing with, and so there was just a complete lack of auctoritas. There was just, so, again, in my own naive way, I thought, well, okay, not that I was here to save the world or save the industry, but I thought, well, if we can bring a little bit of that, to this industry, then maybe we can make something of it. And that's what we did. When we did it there, and we did it in our own practice, when we're advising clients and obviously, and then going out to start up other ventures, is to bring some base and bring some foundation to what one does. But again, the evolution, I'm mindful this is a long answer, but the evolution is also running in parallel with one's view of oneself. And sometimes one's view of oneself has come to a shuddering halt by virtue of external circumstances, whether it be a lockdown, Mark 1, or a separation and divorce, or a business that failed, during the GFC, or whatever, those moments we go, hang on, maybe I need to revisit the model. And whether it's a model of leadership or business practices, but I think more importantly and foundational to that, the model of self. And having the temerity and the wherewithal and the guts and the balls, if you need to edit that out, you can, but, to have the temerity to actually go, okay, where am I responsible in this matter? This salesperson's not performing. Is it me? Is it them? Is it the training? Is it how I'm being about it? Is it a perception? Is it how I'm seeing them, which has them show up in a particular way? Like, what's my responsibility here? And it's my view that it's entirely my responsibility. It's actually entirely my responsibility. So yeah, it's a fantastic, it's a fascinating topic that I could talk about forever.
And I think it's a topic that just becomes ever more relevant the higher one climbs, because the dark triad of narcissism, Machiavellianism and psychopathy tend to become ever stronger with a lot of individuals the more money or the more power tends to be on the table, and that those traits often crowd out that reflection, that questioning, that negative self-love, where the idea of I am almost omniscient, invulnerable, infallible, and therefore fault always must lie with the other. If I've missed something, if I've made a poor decision, I'm going to double down on my team regarding them, their process, what they raised. And that notion of accountability, which always seems to sit with the other, the accountability at home of, well, did I do everything I could have done to achieve that often vanishes when those dark triad traits come in.
Yeah, I mean, there's the sort of standard books that you various bosses or, you know, self-help or whatever, you know, it's yeah, okay, well, you know, read The Prince.
Yeah.
Okay, well, that's fine, read The Prince, you know, and funnily enough, ironically, you know, Machiavelli's down there on York Street or Clarence, that's right. That was the place to go. The minute you knew you'd made it, and for those that are sort of listening to the podcast or watching the podcast and not in Sydney, you know, there's a restaurant, it's no longer there, good Italian restaurant on Clarence, a little bit dark and dingy. You sort of go down a set of stairs and then all of a sudden you're in this environment, and there'd be sort of prime ministers and treasurers and captains of industry and sort of you name it. And I remember the first time going there again as a whippersnapper, probably late 20s, when I just cracked into a slightly bigger stockbroking firm. And to woo me, they took me there, and I'm sort of goggle-eyed and, oh, I've made it. You know, and then subsequent to that, as you sort of progressed up and you got a corporate card or whatever, you could lash out and take out clients. That's where you go. And I remember the last time I went there was about a week before I left broking. And I'd had enough. I'd had an absolute gutful of the pretense, of the snootyism, of the, you know, let them eat cake sort of environment, that it just was icky. It was just absolutely icky. Alluring, super alluring, but thankfully one's eyes open at one particular point.
And just picking up on that theme of the visibility, the conspicuous consumption, the conspicuous power, conspicuous wealth, do you find that to be something of a leadership challenge in a direct sales environment where results are incredibly visible and incredibly constant? A lot of employees, be you a manager or a rank and file employee, your work is often a little bit more amorphous. If I'm in the tech sector, I might write a business case, which is not a business case, a user story, which is a very small component in an overall project. And so the overall project might be a success, but it's not as much of a binary input as indirect sales roles it can be. And how does leading people and teams in that environment where performance is measured weekly, sometimes daily, change what leadership can honestly be? Does it make you more of a coach, more of an accountant? What does it cause you to lean into?
If you permit me,
I certainly will.
Good. So we'll start with the accountant. In fact, we'll start with, I'm not even sure you'd call them an accountant. I don't know how you'd frame it, but I'll go down one path and then maybe we'll pause and come back to the other. So example B, being the accountant, or being, you know, you are what you do. You know, it was a hark back to, you know, you're on the front line and you might be a hoplite, you know, and the Persians are coming over the hill, you know, and so you've got your shield and you've got your spear and, you know, you've got your sandals on, and that's pretty well it. And you were a hoplite. You weren't a Spartan at that particular point. And you were at the pointy end. And so you were facing, you could kind of see Darius on one side and, you know, the glint of him. So you could see the opposition, but you were very much on the front line. And you were dispensable, highly dispensable. And I'm talking about a time, late 90s, so to dimensionalise that, so that's how long I've been around. When I went from a domestic stockbroking firm to a US firm called Merrill Lynch. And Merrill Lynch came to town, you know, they were known as the Thundering Herd. The emblem in and of itself was highly attractive to a young male, being the bull. It couldn't have been any more alpha. The symbolism was extraordinary, Robert. they domiciled themselves in the MLC Centre here in Sydney. They were up on level nosebleed. Given that the building in and of itself is an octagon or decagon or whatever it is, but you'd have the lift in the middle, and then they sat the intake, so that the new kids on the outside of that concentric ring, and then as you progressed, you moved in symbolically and physically as you moved into the inner circle.
Wow.
Literally. You started life as in what we were, a swallow, and then you were a cormorant, and then you're an egret, and then after 4 or 5 iterations you became an eagle. But that was the penultimate bird, because ultimately what you wanted to become is a falcon. And Falcon's club was both symbolic and actual, or physical, again, with the moving in. You had Olivia Khalil, the head of the desk, terribly well tanned, his sort of lovely suit, cream suits. He liked his cream suits. The duck egg blue shirt, the white collars, red Hermes tie, lovely loafer. He'd sort of sit back laconically, and there'd be Robert, David, John, Jack, Jill, Mary on a perspex wall, our names, and just every now and again, and you wouldn't see them. Your numbers were visible. They were presented to you twice, so in the morning and then the afternoon, every single day. They were visible to you, and they were visible to everybody else. And my God, it worked. It really, really, really worked. And when you reached that part, which I did, so about 180 odd became the Dirty Dozen. Then they sent you over to the Rockefeller Centre, and then you get to see how the real big guys do it. Which again, the trip in and of itself, that's not the topic for today, was highly alluring, but you knew that was there at the end of the equation. So to fly you over to, the heart of the investment universe, you're going to Mecca, but not to circle, to actually be in the centre of it. It really, really, really worked. But obviously for some it didn't. For one it did. It was terribly effective. But my God, what a cost psychologically. And I didn't realise at the time. It took me probably years to realise just what a cost. Because again, if we think about safety and security being at the foundation, and I have my own take on Maslow and the hierarchy of needs, by the way, which we can come to maybe a little bit later, but to my view, it's a continuum rather than a pyramid, and if that's at risk all day, every day, your cortisol levels are just through the roof. And you can do one can do that I did it for a particular period of time, and then there was just whatever that wiring was, one day just burnt out. There was just one day when I just could not do it anymore. Couldn't get out of bed, couldn't face anything. And that was the switch to a different kind of leadership, thankfully, which I found pretty quickly. And I started to gravitate towards coaches. Started to gravitate towards, okay, I admire this person. I'm willing to meet them in that, in the middle. I'm willing to surrender to a degree. But I'm willing to be coached. I'm coachable. I think it was 31, 32 when I finally realised, hang on, it's time to be coachable, not to be such an arrogant so-and-so and believe that I knew it all. And maybe Dad was right after all. And maybe the local sergeant was right after all, and maybe even that headmistress was right after all about some of my traits and behaviours, and so it was time to be coachable. And as I became coachable, I worked out that, hang on, I'm actually a really good coach. Coaching is in my blood. Servant coaching, by the way. Again, we'll probably get to that a little bit later. It's not the coach that yells and screams and demands. It's actually the coach that loves. You know, and bugger it, I'm going to say it. People I lead, I love. I love them. I mean it. You know, and then leaning into that love of one's fellow man or person creates great things. And sometimes to love them is to tell them to leave
Yeah.
with love. Sometimes to love them is to promote them. Sometimes to love them is to have a really tough conversation done with love and respect. That, you know, Robert, you did X, Y, and Z and A, B, and C, and it doesn't work, and it's not working for you, and it's not working for us. So now, by the way, that doesn't throw out the accountancy bit, because inside of that, inside of being a great coach, inside of being a servant leader, it does not serve the salesperson to not know where they stand. It absolutely serves them. So I don't think it's either or, I think it's both. It's both, it's a confluence between the two. And I will finish here, it's also a continuum. So there are going to be days and times, and start of the quarter for us in particular, the way that I tend to run things, it's very, very, very pragmatic. It's not about how we feel, and it's not about kumbaya sessions. It's about, okay, what do we need to achieve and how are we going to do that? So there are times and fights that you're having and in which you need a particular style, in which you're facing a particular opponent, you know, whether that opponent be a soft economic condition or markets that are not great or whatever that may be, or an employee or a staff member that's sort of not pulling the line, well then maybe one needs to lean into a particular way of being as opposed to the other.
That was so incredibly rich, and there are so many threads in that to pull on. I mean, everything from the military analogy, which I think is such an interesting one. You look back historically, and yes, the average soldier was certainly treated as disposable, as cannon fodder. Human life was held much more cheaply in many ways than we hold it today. Yet the leaders built empires. But how sustainable is that? There is that old axiom, empires rise and empires fall. Is it the inevitable nature of empire, or is it actually more the type of leadership that is required to build an empire inevitably burns out or exhausts the resources, and therefore the empire is destined to fall due to the leadership techniques rather than the nature of empire? I think also as you brought that forward into the modern era, and looking at companies like Merrill Lynch, and also even if we expand out from the finance industry, the way in which organizations do measure and manage, because management is so much about that measurement piece. And I think in some sectors, it's measurements be seen as a very dirty word, as a problematic word. Yet, if I'm doing something that I'm fundamentally ill-suited to do, I'm just very bad at it, but I keep striving, I keep pushing, as you say, letting a person go with love is often the healthiest thing for them, as well as for the team, the organization more broadly, because I haven't found my calling. I haven't found that thing that really sparks my day. And I really do believe that all people, when you do go into work, because it is such a large part of life, there should be an engagement that comes from ideally love, but at the very least a degree of affection or enjoyment for what is going on. And I think to simply turn up because I have a bill, it is a salary, I will just keep trudging through, and the more depressed, the more difficult I find it when I burn out, it's just about my manager patching me back up and getting me back on the pitch again, when the healthier thing would be, well, Robert, actually, what is it that fires you and where are you going and how can we help you to achieve that? And that might not be here. I think is such an important and valuable conversation, because I don't believe we can talk about psychological safety. I don't believe we can talk about being servant leaders or being truly invested in our people, but then in the same breath say, but I've got to bind them to the corporation and I've got to bind them to what they're clearly unfit to do and keep driving them, keep helping them, keep pushing them along, rather than finding a healthier way for all involved.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think, and just maybe sort of double clicking on that bit too, let's not also forget the cost, not just to the leader and or the individual on the other side, but it's the cost to the team.
Very much.
You know, my son Luca, and not a terribly clunky kid or klutzy kid when it came to sports, but he's just, and I'm not saying that's just because I'm his dad, but he's a freak, this kid. You know, he'd pick up a tennis racket or a baseball bat or a cricket bat, or he can bowl, he can play footy, whatever. This kid's a freak. And so we found soccer for him. And me, being the coach, what did I do? Of course, when we registered him as an under 5 and got him in his little sort of little cohort, little team, well, the first thing they were missing was a coach. So here we are, right? So I spent half a decade coaching him, in fact, a bit more. And it was wonderful to watch, just on that bit, by the way. They were like sort of foals or little, you know, baby deer falling over their own legs, some of these boys. And some of them, you know, they wouldn't say boo. You know, they're just so scared. And then you had other kids, one or two like Luca, who would just, they just go for it. So to have that little diaspora, our little group of boys, but then also to have the parents as well. Such an interesting dynamic, Robert. And so the first thing we did, I know it sounds dinky, but the first thing we did in under 5s is we sat the boys down and we asked them, what do you want to stand for? What do you want? What do you want? And so we went round one by one and they all gave us something. And we actually landed on 2 or 3 pillars, which we kept for the 6 or 7 years until he got to his 12s. We wanted to have fun. We always wanted to have fun. We wanted to go out, whether it was training, whether it was playing, whatever it was, we are going to do it with a smile and have a ball. But the second thing that we wanted, as controversial as it sounds, we wanted to win. We wanted to win at training. We wanted to win at skill development. And obviously we wanted to win games. Okay? We didn't win, that's okay. Had fun. But did we win in a particular skill that you wanted? I wanted you to, I don't know, work on your long ball in this particular game. Did you do that, Robbie? Yeah, you won. Great, you won that process. Okay. But the third thing, and I didn't say this, it was one of the little quiet kids in the corner, he said, I want everybody to put in. And I said, well, what do you mean by that, mate? He said, I want us to hold standards, quote, unquote.
Wow.
I get a chill when I think about it. So we kept that. We kept that for the entirety of it. Those sort of, I guess, standards or pillars. Now, the fascinating part is kids would come and go. We sort of had our quorum, but our team actually started to get pretty good, and we started to win things in the 8s and 9s, the 10s. And some of those boys, including my boy, were cherry-picked and put into a development squad. And it was the worst thing that could have happened, because you had kids in there and parents in there with no standards, no pillars, no rocks, right? It's all about the physical prowess of the child who is going to be the next Lionel Messi, right? And they were arrogant little so-and-sos. They had no sense of standard, no sense of, they had sense of win, but not together. And there was no fun. There was absolutely no smiles. It was all about them individually. And that's when Luca, one day, after 6 months of this, on a drive home from yet another training session of individualism, another loss, by the way, those teams, I can't remember if we even won a game. Right, it was an awful experience. And one day driving home from training, as a 12-year-old, he said, Dad, you better pull over because I've got to tell you something. I don't want to do this anymore. And young Luca leaned into his logos and logically reasoned with me as to why. You know, because he wasn't adhering to the standards and those pillars that we created when he was an under 5 kid.
And I think that ability to hold the course is is one of the challenges if we can shift gears a little bit and move on to DadBodz and looking at that notion of starting something, most critically sticking with something, that ability of consistency. And I think before maybe we start to get into the leadership of it, can you maybe tell listeners what DadBodz is, who it's for, and what was the moment you decided to build it?
The moment I decided to build was on a drive home from Ballina. Would be, God, I'd say 2020, I think, roughly about then. My partner at the time, we're still great mates. She's a great explorer, not from this country, so she wanted to go up and see the sort of south coast, or the north coast, I should say. So we ducked into Byron, and then we ended up staying at Ballina for about a week and a half. And without sounding anything other than what it was, I was in really good shape, like really, really, really good shape. Probably the best shape I've ever been in. I was cycling a lot, hitting the gym. It was a great summer, so I had that lovely bronzage. And the facts are, again, not sort of embellishing this, I was asked continuously, how do you do it? You go to the beach and I'd have a man walk up, or I had a wife walk up. I had kids looking at me, I had people literally ask me, man, you're in good shape, you're in great shape. And obviously you can tell that I've got some salt and pepper. So, at that point I probably had cracked 50 or close to it, and they'd ask, how do you do it? And I'm like, okay, well, and my partner, after one night, actually, we were down at a beachside bar, and this waiter just would not leave me alone. And she sort of laughed afterwards, and she said, you're giving all this away, all your intel away. Maybe you should do something about it. And that's all she said. And when we drove home the next day, she slept for 6 hours, and I thought for 6 hours. And so it was on that drive home, I thought, I'm going to do something about it. And what can I do about it? Well, let's lean into the antithesis of what a DadBod is. And actually, and as I said to all those people then, and I'd say to anybody listening now, the first thing is to be realistic. Be realistic, be pragmatic. I noticed a lot of what was out there on this, were, ripped, 8-pack, vascular, 220-pound sort of 30-year-olds. Well, what about the guy who just wants to go down the beach and feel comfortable to get in some board shorts? Excuse me, and have a ton of energy and feel good, aesthetically, but obviously also energy-wise and physically, and take care of my skin and take care of sort of not just the externals but the internals. And so that was the launch of the brand or the business. And then quickly on that too, I thought it would be okay. It's going to be a training and nutrition and skincare and deportment and how to be a gentleman, right? But in testing the market, what I found was what really resonated was this and this. That's what really resonated. It was more menosh as opposed to soma. And so that's been the transformation in the brand as well, of what we're trying to achieve here. And I've partnered with a few other organisations beneath the surface as one, so I'll give them a little plug. I had the fortunate opportunity to meet Adam Hubbard a few years ago, and his brand and the way that he's built that whole mind connection and the ability for one to be able to pause and breathe and create space to make great decisions, both personally and professionally, is extraordinary. So I've really leaned into that. And then the brand also, DadBodz, together with some other founders, we've commenced Nexus Holistic Health as well, which we might come back to a little bit later. But that is effectively a telehealth business. So there's a number of different solutions within the brand. what I was originally thinking that we would.
And I think that mental element is something. I mean, I'm a relatively new-ish father. My little one's coming up for 18 months old. But certainly the mind has been the far bigger battle. I mean, yes, the body feels the age a little bit, but the bigger challenge is you find some space in your week. You've changed the nappies, you've done the feeding, you've taken care of the little one, you've satisfied your fiduciary duties at work, and you've kept your job. I've got an hour to myself, but I feel so both invigorated but also shattered by the process. All I want to do is just sit down. And yet that mental ability to find that spark, to hit the gym, to go for a cycle, to go for a walk, that can often be the bigger battle. And I found myself certainly going through a phase where I cited it as a time problem. Oh, I've got no time in my day, that's why I can't train. And certainly time was a pressure, but time, once you look at it intellectually, starts to become more of a management problem than it does necessarily there are only 24 hours in a day, obviously within reason. And so I do love the fact that DadBodz has been driven around that mental aspect to the health process.
Mm. And you can tell just how much I admire my father, but Dad was not like me. He was a man of few words, but he had a saying, and he also spoke a little bit of French, so pardon me when I use it. But he'd say, poor old fathers, they're up the arse end of the universe, right? So there's kids first, kids second, immediate family third, school events, sport, and you're going to go down this journey, my friends. So I wish you all the best of luck as a father of teens now with this. Shopping, food, mortgage, bills, you name it, weddings, bar mitzvahs, funerals, brisses, you name it. There's all the things. And then there's a huge chasm. And right over there in the corner is your poor old father. Way over there in the corner. Okay. Now this is not a poor me statement, by the way. Okay. This is not a woe is me, seeking empathy or sympathy. Quite the opposite. It's just and look, same could be said for poor old mum. She gets hammered from A to Z. She's on the hook. She's the sole carer. Sometimes she has to give up time of her career. Like I've seen all that too. I'm not saying one versus the other. I'm just describing as is, just for Dad. Okay. And so again, on the mental side, or where dads sit with that, and I saw it with my dad. It's not my position. It's got nothing to do with time. Zero. It's got everything to do with priority. Okay? Everything to do with priority. And again, as controversial as it may sound, my belief is to be the best father one can be, it needs to start with me. And so if it means that I get up at 4, which I do, and if it means that I spend 5 minutes in the cold shower, 15 minutes deep breathing, 20 or 30 minutes writing, and then I move at 5, no matter what. Okay. I moved this morning before this because I wanted to be at the ready. Okay. I don't want to roll into your interview in which you kindly enough invited me along as a friend and a colleague not being ready and giving the best that I can give. Or if I picking up the kids on the weekend, or delivering a sermon in a boardroom. It's my responsibility. I'm the man on the mountain, and as the leader of the house, or the leader of the business, or whatever that one is seeking to create, or just simply as an interviewee, it's my responsibility to be ready for that, and that takes prioritization over self. Prioritization of self, one's self-care, how one thinks about oneself, how one breathes, what you consume, whether it be orally, or audio-wise, or visually, or those that you surround yourself, or whatever you do. And if you choose to doom scroll, great. do it. If you choose to sit mindlessly in front of the TV for a while and that's what you want to do it without fear or guilt. If you want to go and hit the gym and be a gym head, which I love doing, do that. If it's macrame or cooking, like whatever the heck it is, don't judge it, but do it and prioritize yourself for oneself so that it resonates with you, it vibrates you, and it puts you in a better position to be a great bloody dad.
And would you, because I think coming into a venture like DadBodz, I always find it very interesting, particularly when people start something, because when you come into a larger organization, whatever level you're situated, there's a degree of positional authority that comes with what you're doing. Either lack of it, if you're in a very junior role, you don't even have the power to authorize a coffee, up to you can deploy millions or billions of dollars in capital, depending on where you're sitting. And yet when in smaller organizations, particularly as a founder, you often start with a person of one, it doesn't come with that pre-built authority. So what did leading without a title begin to teach you, that the title that you'd obviously built over a long corporate career, what had that potentially been hiding? And sort of two-parting that question, how did that then morph into the nature of leading yourself first, which I think has always been a trait with you throughout life, but did it have to come to the fore even more when positional authority wasn't there, or when you're starting potentially a team even in corporate life from scratch?
Yeah, really good question. I mean, I think DadBodz was very much a solo enterprise, Robert, but where it started to come to the fore very, very, very quickly is when sort of that brand, together with two other founders, and we'll call them Liv and Lance because that's their name, Danes. And again, I'll try and be relevant here because there's quite a long story as to how we got to it, but in short, we got to it over sort of some coffees one morning when we sort of looked at what Liv was doing in a particular telehealth business that wasn't working and wasn't aligned to her values, and Lance, my close friend, those two being together, sort of me having the opportunity to hear this by proxy, then sitting here with the DadBodz project and what we're seeking to achieve, and again that furtherment and betterment of a father and a leader, and then saying, well, okay, I'm probably lacking some things here, particularly when it comes to some of the health aspects that men go through, particularly hormone-wise, and cognitive function and heart function and so on, and having a look at what Liv was doing and then bringing that together, and that was the birth of Nexus Holistic. So effectively a telehealth business. We thought, again, it would be for men. It's actually, we're probably 60-40 females, and that's all going tremendously well. But in answer to your question, that was, and Liv and Lance, if you're watching this, you'll know, but that was an opportunity to go back to basics and tabula rasa in many ways, and to sit in a kitchen room. I've done that before. In fact, one of my businesses, we literally started in a garage, right? So back in the garage, and back with the whiteboard, and back with no titles, and back with equal view, and there were, again, no chevrons were there by definition, because there were no titles, because we're starting this thing, as I said, tabula rasa or from scratch. And I'm happy to say it, and again, Liv and Lance, we've had this discussion. I had to park my ego in many ways, but it was also healthy. I mean, again, we go back to perspectives. We had that conversation right at the start. And I love Lance when I say this, and Lance knows this. He is a physical guru, amazing PT, the best I've ever worked with, and I've worked with a fair few. And I've been training for 30 years, so I know I can speak with authority. He's the best. Ex-professional athlete, body of a god, but he also knows how to get the best out of people physically. Liv, operational guru. She's world class. She really is. She's such a pedant, for that space. Me, visionary, strategic, very much in the numbers space. So we had to work out a Venn diagram pretty quickly that was also fluid as to, okay, well, what roles and responsibilities, and if Lance wants to talk business, that's cool. It's just not my domain. And if operations, well, if I want to talk operations, that's also not completely Liv's domain. Like, we had to work out pretty quickly, and we did openly, verbally, and then in practice as to who ultimately was the owner, but then how we would sort of share those views in an open environment. And we also, again, going back to sort of the story of our Fighting Irish, the little soccer team, we established some rules of engagement pretty quickly as well. So we actually spoke about that out loud, and what deadlocks look like, and how we were to deal with things. And we got into a rhythm pretty quickly as to having no fear of having an open conversation, and some of them were pretty forthright. We're not bloody doing that, we're doing this, right? So that's continued. It's also put us in good stead. We've been very fortunate to attract some new partners, new capital, and new ideas after 6 months of launch. So that's really super exciting. But because we had our shit sorted, we had our way of working sorted. United we stand, divided we fall. And so whilst it might have been a maelstrom in the background and some very active open discussions when we started to engage with choosing between capital partners, they were really super active discussions. It placed us in really good stead to be able to engage with a counterpart, because we all came from a unified position, and we also came from this position. Whilst they're coming with all the capital, we're coming with all the IP. We're coming with all the blood. We're coming with all the sweat. We're coming with all the tears. And so it gave us an opportunity to do that, both between the three of us, but then as we've engaged with suppliers and vendors and now our new capital partners.
So one of the threads that seems to have been running through our discussion is very much self-discipline being a prerequisite for leadership. Yet the leadership philosophy tends to start with the notion of leaders acting on others. And so I'm wondering if perhaps the standard has it backwards, because certainly in both my academic work of studying leadership, as well as in my direct work of delivering and experiencing leadership in real life, I've often seen leaders who do have very poor self-discipline. It's not their starting plank. So do you think perhaps there's an argument to be made that the leadership philosophy, which starts as acting on others, perhaps has it backwards, and we should start to reimagine it as having this self-discipline as an initial plank?
1,000,000%. I'm not going to go to a PT who's out of shape. I'm not going to go to an accountant who hasn't lodged his tax returns. I'm not going to go to a lawyer. My lawyer, Mark, I've had for 20-something years, and he was on the other side of the matter, by the way. He was working for the opposition. And when we concluded it favourably, I think, for both parties, commercial dispute, I sort of grabbed him afterwards. He looked quite surprised, actually. He said, "Can I buy you a drink?" And we actually went for a little sort of whiskey. And I said, "Mark, I want you to be my lawyer." He goes, "Why?" And I said, "Well, he'd walk in with, his perfect files with the coloured tabs, and, he was just extraordinary, and he's been my consigliere ever since. So and going back to the stories again, back to sort of high school or the little country town. I just absolutely loved the police sergeant, because he was in our world as ratbag kids. We'd sort of drive around and he'd pull you aside and have a little quiet word with you and say, "Mate, you're doing X, Y, and Z. Don't do it, because I'm going to have to belt you, or lock you up," or whatever he'd sort of threaten us with. But I guess point being, I've always gravitated towards those that demonstrate, as opposed to remonstrate. I love self-discipline. That's where I personally thrive. And again, we sort of touched on that a little bit earlier around, the morning routine, the midday routine, the afternoon routine, the evening pre-bed or sleep routine, applications of things like the Eisenhower matrix on a constant basis. I Pomodoro most things. I'm pretty bloody good with it. Obviously sometimes you need to be fluid, clearly. The kids kind of like it, I think. But we're planning a trip, to Japan early next year. Well, we are going to know exactly when we're landing, when we're getting on the train, the 15 things we're doing that very first day. Like, I will map it.
Love it.
Yeah. Sometimes it drives my partners crazy. But I think that, just on that demonstration is so key. And if you indulge me, I actually have created a little, it's quite the framework. So, Statio Sacra, Spiritus Certus, Disciplina Eterna. So sacred ground around, your lovely sacred ground that I can see in your background there. Your study, the way it's set up, that's sacred. It's also sacred internally. The thoughts that I have, and as they pop up, which they undoubtedly do, well, I'm going to prosecute those thoughts or put them in front of a court of law. Do they serve me? Do they not? Are they helpful right now? Probably not. If they're not, well then, thank you for the thought, but it can reside elsewhere. Sanctity of relationships. Sanctity of consumption that we spoke about earlier. Like, that is just so important, which then leads into be certain in one's spirit and certain in when you're making the call. Schwarzkopf said it, when in command, take charge. Okay, make the hard decisions, obtain 20, 30, 40% of intel, and then go. Well, you can't do that if there's not a sanctity of thought and a certainty of spirit. Like you can read his Schwarzkopf's sort of laws, but you can't apply them if you don't have that foundation. Is my view. But then discipline eterna, like always. And it's not to say I don't lounge binge or Netflix binge or whatever. But paradoxically or ironically, I do it with discipline. I'm like, oh, effort. I love rugby league. I watch pretty well every single game. That's a lot of time. But that's a priority for me. And you could argue it's a discipline, and I bloody love it. And I'm on a group chat with the other dads, and we love it too. So there's very much those pillars of foundation, and then very quickly, I know we don't have forever, DLF, RMS, data, layering, facts, replicate, mastery, stand. What is the data that I'm working from? So data over feelings, not throwing feelings out, Robert, but what is the data telling me here? Okay, I didn't Pomodoro today. I didn't Eisenhower matrix. I got completely distracted. I barked at an employee and I got the poos with a client. Okay, well, they're all things that occurred, phenomena. So what's the data telling me? Well, I didn't sleep well the night before and I ate chocolate all weekend and I had an argument with the kids or whatever. Okay, well then let's reset oneself, breathe, and get back to a position where I have certainty of spirit and reinstate that sanctity. Okay, and then doing that every day is layering. Every single time when you make your bed or you have the cold shower or you do the deep breathing, they're just little increments psychologically and neural, across those neural pathways of layering. And then work with the facts. So what are the facts of the time? And radical acceptance sometimes of those facts. And then if I do those things, then I just replicate it. And employees see that. They see those actions. Your kids see it. Your wife sees it. Your little baby will see that. She'll see the consistency of dad being there no matter what. And if she's crying and screaming, loving her even harder. And if she's being a little terrible 2-year-old, loving her harder still. And I do not subscribe, by the way, to terrible teens. My teens are getting better and better and better every single day. I don't subscribe to that narrative. The old children shall be seen and not heard, and the youth of today, which I think it was ascribed to Plato or Socrates, I can never remember. So just replicate that every single day as much as possible, and then course correct if I need to, but because that ultimately leads to mastery of self, mastery of one's own domain, mastery of emotions, an ability therefore to be able to be a servant leader for others and to have a stand for that. So I've spent a lot of time, as we mentioned at the top of the conversation, being eclectic around passages from Marcus Aurelius, which is standard for me now as a Roman, as a man, in each and every action and each and every moment, treat it with sanctity. If I can just do that, the gods can expect nothing else of me. I can expect nothing else of me. My employees, my boss, my bank manager, whomever it may be that I'm interacting with can expect nothing else of me if I'm treating all of that with sanctity and in that very moment and giving all of myself to it.
Beautiful. We might look to closing on a bit of a lightning round. Ready for some quickfire questions?
Let's roll.
The most overrated word in leadership?
It's meant to be lightning, isn't it?
Well, shall we say lightning-esque?
Yeah. Okay. The most overused word in leadership. Alignment.
I'd agree. The last time you changed your mind about how to lead somebody?
3 to 4 weeks ago. Wasn't getting anywhere, but tried option A, option B, option C, option D. And I actually ended up asking them. And they gave me the answer. Hooray!
Nice. Sometimes the best solutions are often the simplest.
Yep.
One habit you've carried from the sales floor into DadBodz and one you have carried the other way?
It's absolutely swallowing the frog. So we come out of the Insti sales meeting in the morning at 0800. You get your call scripts together, and then by 8:29 you're on the phone straight away. Okay, and you always call your toughest sales first. Absolutely, you always call your toughest sales first. Get to the no pretty quickly. In selling, we enjoy no's because it got me a step closer to the yes. So the other way of coining that is 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, or cold shower it. In the morning, get up, make bed, straight in the cold shower. I don't even think about it. Okay, so it's that ability to be able to go like that straight away. Get the slap in the face really, really, really quickly. And that's the same thing with DadBodz. And then when we made the decision to morph that and then to attract the capital partners, is just to go straight away. Get on the phone straight away. Have the conversation straight away. Swallow the frog straight away.
Yeah, interesting. Sorry, just to digress, but thinking of that getting to the no quickly, it always sort of reminds me of that sales adage I heard, no's negotiable, yes isn't.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. It gives you something to work with. In terms of what I've discarded, arrogance.
Yeah.
Yeah, very much humility, man. Very much being the student of self, student of life, student of the employee that I had the chat with, a few weeks ago. So completely just ditching arrogance and actual being a nubile, almost in a constant state of neoteny, really. I think it's a wonderful place to be.
Certainly almost.
It's exciting, actually. Sorry, Robert. It's exciting because I feel like a kid again. I've always been a big kid, but I'm a big kid. You know, okay, what can I find out now? Great. Okay, that's a different way of looking at life or doing something.
Yeah. No, I was only going to add sort of so much. I sort of feel the writings of Marcus Aurelius coming through that, in that sense of emperor of the Roman world, but not getting so above himself, trying to constantly check that sense of arrogance that could very easily come with such extraordinary power.
For the listener,
Yeah.
for the listener, if they've read Meditations, that's fine. Read the letters.
Yeah.
To Fronto. That's where the real joy is. When you have the God on earth, or leader of the free world, you know, the emperor, looking to his master. Those letters are beautiful, actually. So I commend that to the listener.
Such a good call out. I think so often the most famous work sometimes overshadows the work that, in a sense, did the work, was the most essential element. I always cite that with Machiavelli. The prince is always named, but his On Civics is really where so much of the extraordinary thinking happened. Discipline or judgment? If you could develop only one in a young leader.
I go back to my previous point. Definitely.
That's it.
It's meant to be lightning, so my first thought's my best thought. You know, my first thought was judgment, actually. As I logically then started to rationalise in my own mind, oh no, I better go with discipline because I've just spoken about it. I think judgment. Something I've struggled with. Judgment as to calls, you know, sitting in a state of apoplexy. Ironically, having such a logical, pragmatic mind, but at the same time being very, very, very acutely aware of one's emotions, that can lead to apoplexy, because the heart might say one thing and the mind says another. I was having a lovely lunch actually with a very close colleague of mine the other day, and he and I talk about love, life, and the universe and all things, you know, and I'm coming up to a very big decision, which you and I were talking about prior to the interview. And he said to me, David, you've got two tracks. You've got your heart and your soul, and then you have your mind. Don't conflate the two. Look at them objectively, and then that will provide you some elements upon which you can make a decision. So I think judgment as to what you do, who you do it with, how you do it, how you manage yourself, how you apply a discipline, how you don't apply discipline in certain areas. So maybe discipline, as I think about it, is more of a mechanism or a framework that can provide one, you know, an ability to navigate life, love, business, whatever. That's just a physical function, isn't it? Judgment is the context in which all those things happen. So that's such a ripper question. I'll just sit on that one for a little while.
And I do think that's so wise, because without judgment, you can be very disciplined at doing completely the wrong thing. And then you're surprised at the result. But I was so disciplined. Great. Almost.
Luca is so disciplined at his Xbox and his, you know, whatever the heck. And I'm like, son, if only you could turn your wiles to good and not evil, you'd rule the world.
And finally, a thinker, living or dead, you'd put in front of your team for an hour.
Tempted to say Jesus. Yeah, I'd say Marcus. Only because I love to spend the hour with him as well. Yeah,
selfish pleasures.
Again, you know, yeah, exactly, mate. I mean, I think there's so many. I mean, I think if look, the way that I would answer that, actually, I know it's lightning, but the way that I would answer that is styles make fights. So if we're in the trenches and, you know, the Germans are coming over the hill and we're at threat, I would love to be in a room with Lincoln.
Yeah. Because
he'd get down in the trenches with us in the blood and the guts and the excrement and the sweat and the tears. He wouldn't be up on the pulpit, you know, and he'd deliver 235 words or whatever it was, you know, the Gettysburg Address, you know, and he'd do it without florid hyperbole, you know. So if we were facing, you know, the apocalypse. That's who I'd love in the room. If it was creation and foundation and providing a framework for life, it would be Marcus. So I think it would be, entirely determined by what was happening at that particular point in time. If we wanted to go to the moon, that's easy. We'd be at Rice University and it'd be, 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and he'd still be in a suit, the President of the United States, and he'd be a little loose on his logos. He'd make some inferential leaps between the Mayflower, and landing on the field of Mars. So you kind of look beyond that a little bit. But and he'd lean on his credibility, but he'd do it subtly, as an honorary professor. It's my pleasure to speak here today. Okay, well, I get that, right? But my God, what a storyteller. And to lean into all the rhetorical devices, but so elegantly, and so naturally, without, and maybe, perhaps, I've often thought about this, did he sit down, and he probably did, work out every single word, and every single intonation, and every single nod and wink and smile? Or did this just come by virtue of a framework that he just swam in? So to be able to move a nation, if we needed to move a nation and to send man to the moon, even though we'd mucked up in the Bay of Pigs just a little while prior to that. So we had to do a real big turnaround. We had to not only convince those at the university, we had to convince the ones that are writing the checks, and we also had to scare the Russians as well, didn't we? So we had to do a number of things all in the one speech. So if that was the task, then we'd have JFK for now.
I think even it almost returns us to judgment, that fantastic capacity to risk the certainty, in case of Lincoln, risk the Union, but because we're questing to use the poetic license, to touch the face of God, which I think so often we are trying to do, and the certainty feels comfortable, but that ability to have that judgment, to realise where we can and should be going, it's the essence of leadership. Look, David, as ever, it's been a delight to talk to you. I love our time together. I hope to have many more sessions to come. So, David Harvie, on the subject of leadership, good night and good luck.
Thank you so much, and as a pleasure, it's also mine as well, mate. Thank you so much. I really, really, really appreciate it. Thank you.